Okay, Dean, the YouTube should be live momentarily. If you wanted to send people over there. One thing, of course, that we're live on YouTube. Okay, one thing, of course, we love for YouTube, for anyone who is watching, is, give us some comments, give us some ideas in the chat field, because we're always up for bringing as many voices into these dialogues as possible. But that being said, we are here today with another popular culture dialogue. This time we are talking about the topic of transmedia. And I was just speaking with our esteemed guests before we started streaming about why I find this topic so fascinating. And for me as an academic, it's all the conceptual side. But before we get into what I find interesting and what you all find interesting, we, of course, always want to introduce our guests and allow them to speak for themselves and to say what brings them to this dialogue. So, Princess, you are a returning guest. EJ, have you been on before? I think you've been on once. No, not yet. Okay.
All right, let me unmute. No, I have not been on before.
Awesome. So we have two new guests, which I totally love. But Princess, you are the returning, so I'm going to let you go first and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Princess Onaika Ogis. I'm from St. Lucia. I have degrees in English, religion, and history, and certificates in editing and medieval history and medieval religion and all that jazz. I always been interested in pop culture, especially how religion plays into pop culture, but then I'm just a huge fan of pop culture on a whole.
Wonderful. Always love to have you here and with your insights, Princess. Let's go over then to EJ.
Okay. I'm EJ Nielsen. I'm an academic with a background in visual art. My current research stuff focuses primarily on popular culture, especially fan studies, also gender, the monstrous, and a lot of visual culture tying in with all of that because of my background. Currently working on a dissertation on fan art.
Very awesome. Great to have you here, EJ. I've known you in passing, so this is our first time to actually having more of a face-to-face, which is always wonderful with the new technologies, being the old fogey that I am. Donna, we're going to go to you as our next new guest.
Hi, I've been writing and reading fan fiction for over 20 years in many fandoms. I also have an interest in translation and in writing song parodies. And I have a lot of thoughts on how different media change the narrative.
Wonderful. That's kind of what transmedia is all about. And I wrote a textbook recently in which I talk about transmedia, not just in terms of popular culture and entertainment, but in terms of marketing and journalism as well. So I'm very interested in transmedia. But before I get further then and start off our conversation, I just want to thank Dean for being here. And of course, Dean is our multimedia editor. So if you are interested in participating in any of these dialogues, Dean is the person of contact. And they will help to organize everything. Dean, I don't know if you want to say anything before we got started.
Just that I'm really glad to be here.
I'm glad for the guests you brought me. I'm very happy and looking forward to this because we have individuals from, sorry, Dean. But we have individuals from different backgrounds. And I was going to say academic backgrounds, but I don't like that because to me, academia is much more of a mindset than anything else. And intelligence does not just occur within the ivory walls. I think that's complete BS for one thing.
Sometimes it doesn't even occur within the ivory walls.
And that's kind of the big thing here. So I like this idea of having smart people talking about topics. So let's just dive into this topic. And I think the interesting thing to start with, especially given something that Donna and I were talking about before we started streaming, is does the concept of transmedia still matter? Like we had this idea coming out of, Henry Jenkins and the convergence culture and all of this stuff back from like the beginning of the century, talking about a story that is told in more than one medium. using like the Matrix and that example, the Animatrix, Enter the Matrix game and things like that. But now that we're like 20 plus years into this century, at this point where we have so much social media and so much user-generated content, what does transmedia mean anymore? So I kind of just wanted to throw open the question of what does transmedia mean to you? Like when you hear that term, what do you think about?
If nobody's starting, I'm gonna.
Go for it.
So first of all, this term is relatively new to me. I do not have a lot of academic background, as I mentioned before. But the way I see it, I think it matters not in the sense of some media is this and some media is not, but to discuss this facet of stories and experiences, to discuss the way that the different media interact with each other, basically. And as I mentioned before, this is nothing new. Even in Arthurian tales, you had art, you had text, you had ballads, you had everything.
Yeah. EJ?
Yeah, I mean, to follow up on that, especially less actually my communication background and more just art making background, what tools you use to make art affects the art that is made, affects the message, affects how it all works. We all know this. We all understand this intuitively. Whether we're reading something as a comic book or watching something as a film or reading something as a book or a Twitter thread or a meme or reaction gifs, we understand mediums differently. We understand how they communicate differently. By playing with what each medium does, we change the message. I think, too, it's important to think through transmedia as a storytelling device, as a narrative device, as looking and thinking through what the mediums do, and as a marketing device, as a commercial thing, where it's a way of, infamously in comic fandom, having to buy every single comic to understand the story, or having to pay extra for this and this and this and this, because otherwise you can't tell what's going on. That's transmedia, but that's sort of the evil side of transmedia, or the very commercial side of transmedia. So are you using transmedia, I guess, to further a narrative, to expand and think and create within this narrative that you're doing, or is it more of a marketing cash grab where, sorry, you have to buy all the versions of this game and the special edition and the DLC and the whatever, or this narrative isn't even going to make sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that
the
idea
light
of
and dark side of transmedia.
Yeah, that idea of fans became important once, they became central to how you make money in Hollywood, that kind of idea. Princess, what are your thoughts when you hear that word transmedia?
I think of transmedia when I heard of how all the mediums intersect. Even though that the television series might be slightly different from the comic books, but they intersect, and that the television series or the films will reach different audiences than the comic books would. Some people don't like comics. They may not like the Batman comics or the Thor comics, but they will watch on television at the cinema, or they will watch a Batman series or Justice League series. So it intersects, and it actually brings in new audiences to that theme or story line. I never really have seen the dark side per se of transmedia, because I usually, when I think of transmedia, I see benefits to it, because I always see transmedia as bringing different and new audiences to the storyline.
This is interesting then, because listening to the three of you, it sounds like there are two main ways that we're thinking about transmedia. And so let me know if what I'm hearing is what you're seeing or not. On the one hand, it sounds like you almost have that fan-centric approach, where it's how the fan sees the characters and the stories being adapted and translated and showing up in all of these different media. And then you have maybe more of the producer-centric approach, which I think is more like what EJ was talking about with the darker side, where you have a company or director or artist, whatever, but purposefully taking one message, whether it's a story or whatever, splitting that up and putting it in different media so that you essentially have to do a scavenger hunt and collect it all to make sense of that full message. Does that resonate with you? Does that seem to be what we're talking about here, at least, at the very least?
Well, I do see that kind of division. Also, if I interrupt someone else, please tell me. While I do see that division, I don't think it's necessarily just, it's very easy to align it with good and evil, the way EJ mentioned. But there is a difference between the story that you want to tell and the story that is being perceived. And fandom in and of itself, something I really wanted to talk about, is extremely transmedia experience. And then you can like export the media to new media, basically.
Yeah, I guess I see the difference to some degree in kind of your motivation. You know, are you doing this to push the story? Are you doing this to explore different aspects of the story through different medium? Because you can do it. You know, if you do it long form this way, then you have the space to do this. If you do it in this medium, you can do something else you haven't been able to do. Or as sometimes happens with corporations and intellectual property holders, are they doing it explicitly to make people purchase more things, spend more money, do more things, which historically has been the case with again, most well-known, I think, comic things, where in order to follow a particular comic narrative, you have to buy all of the series, or in order to particularly understand this, you have to buy additional things. Like, is it a way of furthering the story or furthering the economic burden on the reader, on the experiencer?
Oh, that's absolutely a thing. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just focused on the fanish side, so people don't do that usually.
No. If you're, especially if you're not making money off things, then it's just, and it is wonderful to see what you can do in a different medium. Films Into the Spider-Verse is a fantastic use, I think, of what you can do with the technology of that animation style to really push the narrative and move between flat and 3D in this way that only that particular animation style could do, to push it further than I think a comic would, or attempting to do it live action would have done. And that's incredible. I love that. I think all media is transmedia at this particular point in time, with social media, with the way that we engage with it, because we very rarely engage with something merely in one medium. If we read a book and we like it, then we are making memes about it. We are, people are writing fanfic or drawing fan art, or at some point, maybe there's going to be a movie or a TV show or a thing made with it. We don't engage with the world in one singular media. And I don't think we engage with any form of narrative in one singular media at this particular point, because anything we do is also going to get cross-engaged with, both at the level of the people making the work and the level of the people engaging with the work. It's very quickly going to become something else. I mean, as we've seen with Goncharov on Tumblr, where they have decided to collectively create a film, like a 1970s Martin Scorsese film that never existed. And now there are memes and fan art and fic and trailers and all sorts of weird ephemera and things around this object of media that does not itself exist, but that's already transmedia right there. Look at all the different ways that is being expressed. So to return to your kind of earlier question, like, is transmedia even a useful term? Sometimes no. Sometimes it's, if everything is transmedia, then do we need to say transmedia? Do we need to be explicit about transmedia, when in so many ways kind of everything is, everything is being experienced that? What does using that as a term add to our understanding of what's going on?
Yeah. Yeah, and in my thinking too about looking at it versus fan-centric versus producer-centric, I'm also not saying, there are some people who are just producers and some people who are just fans. That boundary is gone now at this point. And I think we do see a lot of people who don't have perhaps a corporation behind them and don't have the Hollywood machine to support them, but they're also engaging as transmedia producers, likely because they were fans in a transmedia world already. But it does then, like you were saying, EJ, bring up the question, does transmedia mean anything at this point? Princess, did you want to jump in?
Well, I do see where EJ is coming from about how corporations do exploit the transmedia and the storyline. But also I want to say that sometimes if fans of the story of one medium may not like the other medium and vice versa. I know tons of people that never like DC Comics, but they like the television series is based on DC Comics and vice versa. So while I'm not saying that exploitation doesn't happen, I think that for the most part, I think in my experience with what I see, transmedia has been really intersectional and bringing new people to the stories.
Yeah, I guess I see that as being a little bit different because each of those is also complete narratives. You don't need to engage with all this other stuff to just see things in a different medium. The DC or MC or things like that don't require that. I was thinking in the sense of exploitative, very specifically when it is a single narrative that they have chopped up into pieces and you have to scavenger hunt as a fan those pieces through different media for the narrative to make any sense. Like, as long as you can watch a DC movie and not have to have the backstory and not have to have everything for it to make sense, or to read something or to watch a show, and they've included enough that you're not required for it to be a cohesive single narrative. Everything adding on and expanding on that's a beautiful multiverse thing. And I see that as being a little bit different. If the only way it made sense because you didn't understand that Batman's motivation was the death of his parents, and the only way for you to understand that was to go off and buy something else, watch whatever, because the film didn't make sense without it. Like that, I would see as being more of an issue than just expanding into a new medium. That's wonderful. And it's fascinating to see what you can do with those. Certainly there's lots of people that have watched the MCU that don't read the comics. There are lots of people who have watched, things based on video games without knowing the video games, or have played the video games without knowing the media, or play Pokemon Go and have never watched the anime or whatever, things like that. That's just beautiful expansion of things. And I think that's fascinating. Again, I was thinking more sort of the scavenger hunt thing that occasionally companies will do as a way of getting things, not as just expanding into new media, which again, you're right. There's people that like, I don't want to read this, I want to watch this, or I don't want to watch this, I want to read this, or the book was way better, or to heck with the book, the movie was way better. Or the reboot was better, or the original was better, and that's wonderful because we all engage with media differently and we all get something differently out of it. And that you don't have to know anything about the Star Wars Extended Universe to watch the films. You don't have to know very much about anything to play the Lego video games based on things, which are adorable. So can you enjoy it without having that extensive thing? Do engaging with other things add to the narrative in a way that brings you joy by broadening it, widening it, and making it more beautiful and wonderful? Or do you have to because they make it a slag, because they make it so that you are required to do something versus enjoying what it does to explore new things? And there's a cat behind you. Hello, cat.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I got 3 cats right now. They're all running around in here. So
EJ, can I say a couple things? Because
Sure.
I have some thoughts about this. 2 things. One is accessibility, and I will be back to it in a minute. The second is sometimes the scavenger hunt does not have to be evil. The scavenger hunt can be part of the experience. Like, I am currently in the fandom of Homestuck. Press F to pay respects, as they say on Tumblr. And it is a very intensely multimedia fandom. Like, you have chat logs, you have little playable games, you have GIFs, you have music, you have a lot of things in this, just in the canon itself, in the self-contained canon itself.
Mhm.
And on one hand, getting to actually process all these things is kind of a scavenger hunt, but sometimes you want the experience of being like, oh, I discovered a new piece, I discovered a new piece. I'm not saying like that what you said is not actually a bad thing. I just don't think it's the scavenger hunt that makes it bad. And like think about ARG, alternate reality games, right? The entire point is you go and you're like, oh, what's this mean? What's this mean? But
Yeah,
I think the difference is it meant to bring joy and to give an experience, or is it meant to get money?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think part of the thing though too is to remember that that's a both and. For Disney, yes, Disney of course is trying to bring joy to people because their entire, business model is based on that idea.
All right,
But they're
we're up to
also
2 cats. I'm
Yeah,
hoping
well-
we get to 3. That's beautiful.
Yeah. I had him mute because the black one is a talker. But Disney, of course, they're in it for making joy. If they weren't in it for making joy, if people didn't like what they were doing, they would not be the powerhouse that they are when it comes to media production. But it is also about them making money because they want to make money. They want to stay the powerhouse. And I think an interesting example that kind of touches at both what you were both saying is the most recent Doctor Strange movie, the MCU, Multiverse of Madness, even though they only went to 3 universes. If you did not see WandaVision on the Disney Plus streaming app, a lot of what happens in that movie does not make a lot of sense. So that was one of those instances where the MCU very directly was connecting what was happening in a movie to the television show so that you could not really get the same experience without, having that background. But at the same time, it's also a Sam Raimi film. So Sam Raimi film means you're going to have Bruce Campbell because they work together. They're best friends. So if you don't know who Bruce Campbell is, though, if you don't have that background, if you don't have that fandom, then his popping up won't mean the same to you. So that intertextuality comes into play as well from the fan-centric point of view. But then, of course, the reason you put that in the film, if you're Sam Raimi, if you are Disney, is because you want to create these Easter eggs and this fan service, because that's another way to get the fans to have joy, which is then another way for you to get money. So it's not like it's an either or. These are definitely a both and I think transmedia to an extent kind of demonstrates that interesting flip we're seeing in the 21st century away from the binary either or to the much more inclusive both and.
I was actually thinking about like logic operators here. So you have multimedia experiences which give you the same content in different medias, essentially. One good example I have of this is podcasts with transcripts. I cannot listen to podcasts. I was in the Magnus Archives fandom for a while, and the reason this happened is because they had transcripts, and I read all of it. You can, and that's the thing I said about accessibility. If you have a media where you have different bits of the story in different kinds of media, that's going to limit the kinds of people it's accessible to. Specifically from mostly an ability thing, like if you're visual impaired and half of a thing is flash movies with no dialogue, what you gonna do? At the same time, what you said about accessibility and Easter eggs, that's another kind of accessibility to people who don't have that knowledge. And I think it's important to have things that appeal to a narrower crowd of people, because I'm a narrow crowd of people. I want things that appeal to me. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And intertextuality is a great phrase to be bringing into this discussion, because so much of what we're talking about is transmedia as a form of intertextuality.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's why I think sometimes transmedia may or may not be the most useful term, because it sort of implies binary. Is like there are stories that are transmedia and there's stories that aren't. And of course, all stories at this particular juncture of our history, if not well before this, are also transmedia, are also intertextual. So to some degree, it's always, this scale of how intertextual, this scale of how many different media does the narrative involve and how many of them do you have to engage with? The difference between if I catch this Easter egg, it will improve my viewing of the film, but I don't need to. How necessary is it for that? How necessary is it for watching The Mandalorian for you to understand the significance of the Darksaber? And I mean, I was watching that with my family. That's one of our holiday traditions is marathoning a season of The Mandalorian now. And they always turn to me after each episode and go, okay, can you explain who all of those people are? Can you explain all of the stuff that's going on? Because they expect me to have that background in Star Wars where I can say, okay, oh, that's who that is. That's the significance. And for some of those, it does help if you've watched Star Wars Rebels, if you have watched various other media prior to this point, because there are characters that are appearing in The Mandalorian who have appeared in other Star Wars media. And by other media, I mean not the films, but the animated TV series and other things. So to know from those things. And I think it's always a question, how necessary is that? Is it adding something? Is it limiting you? And there's not an either or there either. It's this whole scale of how much do you have to be involved in things? Because again, to watch The Mandalorian, it really helps if you watch the original Star Wars movies. It helps if you know what a Star War is, as it were. It helps if you understand why people are calling it a Baby Yoda, things like that. It's or why it's a big deal if Boba Fett shows up, if it's a big deal to you that Boba Fett showed up, things like that. Every story has so many layers, but even things like genre awareness is a layer of intertextuality, metatextuality. Do you understand when you're watching a superhero film that there's going to be a superhero in it? What do you mean he flies? That doesn't make any sense. Whatever it is, things like that. Everything we engage with kind of requires some level of extant knowledge of something, and to what degree you need that extant level and how specific that extant level is. That's all intertextual. And it's such a big, crazy scale of possibilities for intertextuality and for transmedia. In terms of, again, is it necessary? Is it adding? What are you getting out of it? Or you're getting different things out of it at different points. So it's such a big, crazy open area that sometimes transmedia as a term almost feels like it is trying to establish some weird binary, but this is transmedia and this is not. It's all transmedia. It's all types, kinds, varieties, flavors.
It's transmedia
scales.
if it hasn't been assigned media at birth.
Well, the interesting thing is, though, I'm thinking of, like, I'm old enough to remember when it wasn't that we were talking about digital communication or digital media. It was, new media, because we were distinguishing the media technologies that rely upon computers from the analog. And one of the key defining features that was put forward to separate the new from the old was interactivity. And yet, I've argued in various places now, we are always interacting with the media. It is kind of what, like EJ was saying, it's that scale. Some things maybe have more physical interactivity. Some maybe have more interpretive interactivity, but we're always interacting when we're engaging with something. And it might be that intertextuality or transmedia, those terms used previously to help distinguish, postmodern or convergent culture. They don't mean that anymore because they're not the binary anymore. They are more of a scale. And we need to be thinking about what that means then to say, well, transmedia, intertextuality, interactivity, these are scales, they're not binaries.
One thing that makes me think about, also, Princess, do you want to talk a bit?
Not really. I don't have any comments for this one yet.
Okay. So I'm just gonna go ahead. And basically, I think what you're saying about scale is really important, because when you look at the MCU, you look at the MCU and you look at a comics called XKCD, for example. Should I explain what XKCD is?
I'm good.
Okay, so XKCD is not very accessible to a lot of people. Like, you go in, you read it, and you're like, yeah, that's a math joke, I guess. What's happening here? I have no idea. What did he do with the maps? I don't know. But that doesn't matter. It is aimed at a very small segment of the populace, and it's like, yeah, that's who we are here for. And you're not going to get all the jokes, and that's fine. And when you take the MCU, and the MCU aims to be directed at amounts of people I cannot conceptualize. It aims to be appealing to all these people who have so little in common when you look at it that way. And it's just, I feel that when the bigger and more interconnected you try to make your piece of media, if you write like House of Leaves now, and it has all these references and it's not easy and it's not for everyone, the bigger and more complex you try to make your thing, the fewer people it's going to fit. And when you make something really, really big and interconnected, and you try to sell it to the lowest common denominator, essentially, that was elitist as heck. I apologize.
No.
But you try to market it to as many people as possible who just don't have that much in common, you're gonna wind up with something. I can't watch MCU stuff. I just can't.
It's meant to be tentpole media, if that's a better term.
I don't know what that is, but I believe you.
It's
But
meant to
explain
have
that
the
one.
broadest possible audience,
Yeah.
which is a problem. Oh, please, Princess.
Oh, I was saying to if it makes you feel better, I don't like MCU stuff either. But I see your point. But I think it's not because that they're trying to be connective to. I think because they're not really telling a good story. And a lot of their other media besides the comics are not necessarily good stories. I do believe that, maybe because I'm biased, DC does a better job at interconnectivity.
Well,
Television, maybe. Because I will not agree with you when it comes to movies that DC does a better job.
I'm biased.
I think part of the issue as like has kind of been brought up a couple times in this discussion is you can go for people that really want this sort of rich textual narrative that they have to hunt down and explore and whatever, and that's their joy in it, and that's what they're there for, and that's part of their fanish experience is doing that, and that's like a completely legitimate way to have a fanish experience, or you can have something that is for the kind of person who just wants to read a book, just wants to watch a movie, just wants to whatever, and does not want to do that, which is another completely valid way of engaging with media. But you kind of can't have them both. It's very difficult narratively to do both at the same time well. And some of what the MCU has tried to do is to try to do both of them well together with these films that have to make a lot of money because they cost a lot of money to make, that have to do well overseas. So they also want to make sure that the narrative is such that it can play in markets that are very selective about what they will allow. And they have to cut out the queerness, or they can't have certain supernatural traits, or they can't have certain things that are seen as a threat to the local government, whatever. So you have to pare down aspects of the narrative or have them in mind as you're writing them. But they also want it to tie in with all of these other properties to get people to go and watch WandaVision so that Multiverse of Madness makes sense. They're trying to do all of these things at once, and it is very difficult to do all of these things at once well. And I think they have had varying degrees of success with all of these things at different points. Again, there's all of these are fine per se. It's trying to do them all at the same time is impractical and difficult to manage.
I think you can make the gradient a bit easier, if that makes sense. If you have the kind of creators and community fandom, basically, that is dedicated to making things. It's the difference between, oh, you wouldn't understand, you're not a real fan person, you haven't read The Joker does blah blah blah, and oh, you want to read Discworld? Here, I have like a whole list of charts of which one's the best to start from. Here's how you might want to pick. Here's a list of like where to look up references. And it's absolutely not going to be like, 100%. There are people who took this webcomic I told you about, the one with all the movies. It's got like 4 gigas of media. And somebody went and transcribed this whole thing so visually impaired people could consume it. And people can do a lot of cool stuff.
I mean, honestly, my first transmedia engagement with Homestuck was just seeing the cosplayers, because Homestuck cosplayers had such a large visual presence at conventions for many years. So it would be like, who are those gray-skinned people and what are they doing? And that would be a transmedia engagement with that particular piece, which existed irrespective of my actual familiarity with the content.
So like you can have the barrier of entry be low or be high, but sometimes people build like little staircases or elevators, and that's a thing, and that's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, I said the more and varied and wonderful things are, it's great. I just, again, varying degrees of success, right? Some people, some places
right.
do much
You're
better.
Right. You're right, and
others.
I'm not disputing you. I'm just being like, oh my God, fandom, it's so great. Have you mentioned that fandom is great? Sorry.
But I'm going to push back on the fandom is so great, because one of the things that I think we do see happening, whether you're going to call it a transmedia or you're going to call it an expanded universe, however you want, whatever way we want to phrase that, is that when you do have more and more media products and different types of media technologies, all essentially related to the same intellectual property and thus the same object of affection, the same fandom, allowing for what Princess was saying before, a lot of different people coming in, but then maybe having their specific preferences, saying the book was better, the game was better, blah, 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 blah. That's where you start getting fan conflict to come in. And the rise of fan conflict that we've seen, even within just the past 10 years, is perhaps an indication that there's too much out there and we're not mature enough yet online to handle those differences of opinion.
See, I think that's a matter of just having the right social technologies. Like, to have a good experience of fandom, the trick is to find like a nice little community, which is you and like less than 50 other people who have similar opinions on the source material, and not to talk to anyone else. And
necessarily good though, because I'm thinking US politics at this point, and essentially we've got people who refuse to talk to one another so that we can't solve problems and we can't even agree on the problems. So if we don't have that basic communication literacy in our fandoms, I think it's going to be very hard to apply them to other areas of our life.
I think it's a little hard to say that that's specifically trans. I mean, there have certainly been a lot of cases where issues around transmedia and multiple platforms, multiple whatever, has exacerbated things. But let's be real, and I speak as someone who's been in fandoms for well more than half my life now. It doesn't take much for there to be fan conflict. There can be a single book, there can be a single anything, there can be and there may still be fan conflict in terms of how things are interpreted or chosen or whatever. So this stuff may exacerbate the situation, but I don't think it certainly doesn't create the situation. We'll fight over anything.
Sorry.
Go ahead, for instance.
Talking about fan conflict, it's really hard to prevent that, especially when the different mediums like include like what they did for Lord of the Rings and what's the Fire and Ice?
A Song of Ice and Fire?
Game of Thrones.
Yeah, Song of Ice and Fire.
In the TV television series, they included people of color. But people who were fans of the movies or misinterpreted what Tolkien was saying in his books, describing his books, were who consider themselves really great fans got really offended and there was conflict.
And in the Hunger Games, she wrote those characters to be characters of color, and there was still a big fight when they were cast as characters of color for the big screen.
Yeah.
So I mean, we always bring ourselves into our fandoms, right? We're never a blank slate as a fan. And if people come into a fandom and they already have issues around race and gender and queerness or class or anything else, they're just going to bring that. They're going to bring their sexism with them. They don't leave it at the door. They're going to bring their racism with them. They don't leave it at the door. And yeah, unfortunately, it's always take your prejudice to fandom day.
Yeah, and that's what's happening, I think, with the MC universe and the DC universe. The DC universe is now becoming more diverse, especially on the television shows. There have more people of color, more LGBTQ, more different people of different religious backgrounds. But it seems that the MC universe is not, because they're trying to appeal to everyone, they're not as fast in bringing these types of people, like to piggyback on the comment you made earlier on how they have to cut down on queerness and women. So fan conflict is going to happen either way.
Like the thought I'm having here is like a couple of thoughts. Like fandom absolutely has problems, both with conflict over silly matters, like what kind of relationship dynamic they're having, and over actual real life matters like racism and sexism. That is definitely a thing. That said, I am looking at how far fandom has come just in the years I've been in it. There is so much discussion on how to improve matters of racial representation in fandom. The fandom I'm in specifically, AO Free, Archive of Our Own, it has invented tagging norms the way we know them today, and they are a game changer, I think. And what I have to say about this is, like, there's a quote from Jewish sources, which is, you are not free to abandon the work. No, what did it go? It is not for you to finish the task, and neither are you free to abandon it. So we're not going to fix the world, and we're not going to fix communication, and fandom's not going to be perfect. I feel, however, that a lot of people are doing a lot of work to keep us on the right track, and I want to celebrate that.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say that I think to bring it back a little bit to transmedia here is by the same token, the fact that fandom, the fact that this media exists in so many different spaces means that it is so much more closely tied in with our experiences of things. For example, on social media, if your social media account is talking about politics and your life and your fandom and your whatever and sharing media and whatever, like that all just becomes so intertwined with your life experience. It's not, this thing over here and this thing over here, it's all whatever. And I think that as a form of transmedia, the way that things are all tied together just means that nothing is going to be separated there either, not just media to media, but fandom to life, various other things. It's all of a piece. It's all of an experience that we have, and that is very transmedia. That is very intertwined. Trans fandom.
And specifically, what you were talking about, Carolyn, earlier, about being able to talk to other people and not to be in our own bubbles. It creates a common frame of reference, I think. And that's something too. That's having that can be meaningful, because I mean, if you can tell someone, I don't know, yeah, sexism is a thing, like I can't remember a media example of sexism in pop culture, but I'm sure there are.
There's at least one.
Yes, there is.
One or two.
I'm just blanking here. But like, yeah, but you can use these things to explain to people, see, that's a bad thing. And yeah.
Well, and so like-minded communities is, I think, one of the best things that came about through the World Wide Web in particular, and even the internet to an extent in the 1980s. But that ability to form a community not based on geographic or familial relationships, but on shared affectations, shared thoughts, beliefs, feelings, and so forth, is a great thing. I grew up in the 1980s, 1990s as a kid before World War II. No, that's not me. Before World Wide Web. So I didn't really have that type of growing up and developing my community online that I think I've quite a number of you probably have had. So it was very isolating to be one, a girl, and then two, a girl who is into science fiction, fantasy, and all of these things, because there was no one for me to talk to in rural Wisconsin. So the ability to find people who share your interests, who, because they have similar experiences to an extent, their communication can be easier. It's easier to be able to exchange meaning and to be understood if you have those types of common backgrounds upon which to base what you're saying, how you're saying it, if you're decoding and what so forth. But the other aspect of the internet, specifically through social media platforms that rely on algorithms that essentially track your likes, your affectations, and then does not show you anything else but those things, or rarely shows you anything else. That I do think is a problem. And it's not something that exists just outside of fandom. I think if a fan community within a larger fandom is not paying attention to, the harassment around cosplay or the online harassment around diversity in comics and games and so on and so forth, that is a problem, because we have the idea through social media that it's the vocal minority, but it's the vocal minority then who get things done. And we are rapidly losing platforms that we can go on unless we are willing to disavow some ethics and morals that we have. Zuckerberg, Musk, for example.
I mean, there is like federated social media, but I'm not going to go into that because that's not the topic at all. Okay, yeah, no, somebody else talk.
I say Princess.
Well, I kind of agree with you, Carrie, but the topic is not social media. Though I do believe that Zuckerberg, what's his name, Zook, is better than Musk. I'd rather be on Facebook right now. I prefer Facebook than Twitter, but all billionaires to me are the same. So,
Like, sorry.
You can go on.
Yeah, no, basically just to bring it back to the topic at hand. What we are saying is that when you have a lot of people together and you have a lot of people talking, then the loud minorities get stuff done. But what I'm saying is exactly what you said, that it allows the minorities that are like further apart to come together and do the thing. And specifically today, one of the great things it's not even just today, because I was going to say that with fan culture, it's a lot easier today to create transmedia content for the thing you love. I'm thinking right now about a particular fanfic in which part of the plot was transmitted via diegetic sea shanties. That was amazing. That was an amazing fanfic. And you can do so many cool things. And that absolutely does not repair anything. Well, it repairs some things. But I think that, give us bread and give us roses, that's important too.
And certainly to be a little more optimistic about it, when you think about the history of media, creators now have access to far more tools to be, as you said, to be and play around with transmedia. Things are accessible in a way that they didn't. When Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, he was not doing mock-ups of the timetables. I don't know if he would have wanted to, but technology-wise, that would have been a lot of work to do those sorts of things. And now there is in addition to Dracula Daily, which is taking something that was meant to be faux epistolary and making it epistolary, making it time-based medium. And then there is a Kickstarter where they are taking all of the parts of Dracula and turning them into physical objects. So there is actually Seward's phonograph records in wax. They are making them. They are making Harker's diary written in shorthand. They are making copies of the Telegraph and the newspaper articles and the railroad timetables. They're breaking it down into these imagined physical objects, which never had a reality, which are being given a reality that is fully a post-object reality, as it were. And you can do that now. You can make that now. It's a really neat Kickstarter, in fact. Or you have in some fandoms, I've been working with Our Flag Means Death recently, and they really like the social media AU. And that is telling a narrative entirely through social media, or primarily, not entirely, but primarily through social media posts that they can then create fake screen caps of characters, Twitter and Instagram and Slack chats and WhatsApps and all of these imagined social media experiences for these characters, because and text conversations and things like that, because they have the technology to replicate these in a way that they look quite accurate, they look quite real, and they have a different reality, and then they post them that way. They post them as tweets and things like that, and that's just something that you couldn't have easily done even a few years ago, really. And it's interesting because narrative feels different. It feels different to read something that is meant to be read as a Twitter post, or an image that is meant to be encountered as an Instagram thing, and see the tags on it and understand both the text and the subtext. I mean, having a character written as a modern character reacting with a reaction GIF, we understand on multiple levels. We can bring that into that narrative, and that's really cool and fascinating, and that's very new because the technology was just not there to allow that before now. And now anyone can poke around with that with some reasonable amount of computer access and processing power, can create those things, can create those narratives. It's a lot easier to create animation, to create all sorts of things in a way that was just not, maybe Bram Stoker would have let himself wanting that. I don't know. Who can really say? But various other novelists who created in that style, what would they have been able to do if that had been an option, if creating in these other genres and other medium had been an option? And the fact that we have so many of those medium open to us, the fact that, I remember the giant webcomics boom of the 90s and how cool it was that you could publish as many colors as you wanted, as long and big as you wanted. You were not stuck within the structure of a page, of a traditional published page. Things could be as long or as short or whatever. And of course, being able to publish without worrying about if it was popular, if it sold, if it had to make money. A lot of the issues of the MCU kind of come down to, at the end of the day, they have to make enough money to be profitable. That's what companies do. But to have all these people that publishing and sharing your work became so cheap that people could really afford to do it without worrying so much about whether or not anyone else, like 5 other people wanted to read it, great. One other person wanted to read it, great. It didn't matter to you. You could still economically afford to share your work with the world. And maybe 10 people liked it, maybe 20 people liked it. Maybe 1,000 people liked it. And at some point you're going to publish a physical copy of it, maybe not, but you could do that. And that's when the economies came in to make transmedia feasible, that was a game changer, because even old fanzines still had to either make back the money they cost, or you had to be able to afford to spend whatever it cost to have those things printed, to have those things mailed around. And that's still some cost. That's still, and then the labor cost of assembling and various other stuff. It was certainly cheaper than published works, but there's still money involved in that way. And things just became so cheap to share that we could afford to really create these fandom gift economies that are just like, I made some cool shit and I want to share it with the world, and I can afford to share it with the world for free without having to bankrupt myself, and so I will. It really allowed for the creation of what we consider to be modern contemporary fandoms, is that ability to share freely and widely.
Kind of makes me want to think about, like, again, in a historical context, not a big expert or anything, but in a way it seems almost like there used to be, because the Knights of the Round Table you don't have an actual canon for, right? You have just everybody just made up their own version and had fun with it. And then there's like a dip, and then you have modern fandom as we know it today, I think.
Definitely some things happen in the period between, but yes.
Teeny tiny few things. Again, my degree is in computer science. I know nothing, Jon Snow. Yeah. But basically it feels like there is like an explosion of creativity. Like vids are easier today when you couldn't have had those. You didn't have those that easily like 15 years ago. You had to have like a lot more equipment and things.
I mean, tech, again, you're talking media, tech drives a lot of this stuff. Tech drives the possibility of a lot of this stuff. You know, the printing press drove a lot of stuff. Things becoming cheaper drove a lot of stuff. Different printing technologies, offset lithography, the development of that drove a lot of things. One of the biggest fandom drivers prior to the internet was Xeroxes. Suddenly, people could make reproductions of things very quickly, of images, visual stuff. I mean, prior to that, we had spirit duplicators, mimeographs, and people did make old fanzines with anything they could print with. But as soon as it became easy to like wait till your boss wasn't around, slip back to the Xerox and make yourself some zines, that was a game changer. Because it allowed you to share, to spread, to do that. Every time we get technology that allows us to communicate with each other better, people, fans especially, think of really fun, interesting, weird things to do with any new technology the minute they get their grubby little paws on it. It's beautiful.
But I do think there's also this idea of, technology drives, because I agree, this idea of looking at the Arthurian legends and how the technology of the time would have just kind of been oral communication largely. But then once it became, printing press, then you have le mot d'auteur, however you say it in French. And that almost becomes then the canon for the Arthurian legends to some extent. And I think there's also then an argument to be made that it's not just the technology that drives it, but it's then authority and power that will also start to shape how something is discussed and how the fandom might react. And you have the concretization of a canon. And to kind of tie it back to Princess's background, I think of how, in a sense, the Bible operates in that same way, because a lot of that was just passed down through the oral tradition. But then when you look at the Christianity, and once you had the Catholic Church come in and establish itself as the authority on what was written and what was said, and actually putting it down in writing, then you start to have a very different approach to the content than if it had never existed. If the Catholic Church had never existed and the stories of Christ and everything was just, still oral for a good number of years, it might be a very different outcome for how we think about that religion these days.
It also occurs to me that it seems like before tech, you had a trade-off between how much creative freedom you had and how easy it was to spread it, basically. Like you couldn't put something on the internet. If you wanted people to hear your song, somebody had to go around and perform it. Yeah, and then when you had radios and televisions and whatnot, again, I know nothing. When you had that, then you had access to a lot of art forms, but you had a very smaller variety. And now the internet is kind of making this trade-off less of a thing, but then we're at the mercy of algorithms, and there we go again.
Well, part of what you're talking about too is kind of a holistic framework for things. And that goes into things like copyright and IP law, which the development of copyright has been one of the biggest game changers in terms of creation, in terms of creativity in the last whatever, because prior to that, we did not have, I mean, part of the reason there's not an Arthurian canon per se is because there's not a canon. Anyone could write stories about Arthur, and everyone did for a long time. And up until we started having copyright law, which started saying, no, well, our notions of authorship are very contemporary. The idea of a single author of a text, the idea that authorship was not collaborative, was not based on your authority of knowing previous canon, of knowing what existed beforehand, of kind of an academic thing where it's like you had to know what to come before. And that's why it was big for people to write things and then claim that some dead Greek had actually written them, because like it was a more impressive text to be written by some cool dead Greek than to be written by you know, random 14th century French guy. You had the Romantic era gave us the idea in Western culture of there being this single genius author, this single solitary genius author of a text, not this collaborative thing that was sort of everyone bouncing ideas off everyone else. And then you get copyright, and then you get the idea not just of a single genius author of a text, but you get the idea that also they own that story. And they're the only one that can tell that story, can write that story, that has any authority over that narrative. And that really changes everything, because our ideas of owning a story is new. People didn't used to own stories. People didn't used to be able to say, you can't tell the story about my characters that I created. And probably they hadn't really created those characters either. They were probably based on something else. I mean, this idea that someone can own a story, can own characters, can be the only person who is allowed tell a story. That's new. That's new. I mean, the fact that a lot of these characters are still under copyright, of course, is also Disney. Is also, 90 years plus the life of the author, is because every time Disney might lose some of their rights, they send a bunch of their lawyers to Congress, and they get that pushed back further. Because originally copyright, and it's different in different countries, would be 30 years life of the author. So the author can make money. You want the author to be creative. You want the heirs to make some money. But eventually, the idea is that the stories go back into the great cauldron, melting pot, whatever of humanity, that people get to use those stories again. Which, okay, yeah, 30 years plus the death. But now we don't have that. We have 90 years plus the death. It takes forever until those are common property. And, depending on how Disney does it. And then you get weird ideas around like the Doyle estate coming after the Enola Holmes films, because in the US, not in Britain, not in Canada, in the US, some Sherlock Holmes stories are still in copyright, but not all of them, just the later ones. So the Doyle estate is trying to argue that traits that Sherlock Holmes displays as a character in the Enola Holmes film is from a later story, thus meaning that character trait is still under copyright, and thus they would have had to pay or not be allowed to use it to the Doyle estate. I mean, imagine trying to slice a character that thinly and say, no, he didn't show empathy until a later story. You can't write a Sherlock Holmes with empathy. That's still in copyright. That's what copyright does to narrative. That's what the current legal state of copyright in the US does to narrative. That's how like deli meat slice narrative can get over who owns what copyright in what content. And again, between countries, Britain, if you wrote something, you can publish your own Sherlock Holmes fanfic in the UK as of whatever and have some rights to it, versus in Canada versus in the US, versus what traits, I guess, Holmes does. Eventually, like in another few years or something, he's going to be totally out of copyright. But until then, and then weird things about what aspects of a Disney film are copyright and which aren't, if they're Cinderella, things like that. But that's all very new. That's all very contemporary. That's not something inherent to the human condition or narrative or things like that. That's like 150 years old.
In a way, this modern, it seems to me like this modern notion of copyright kind of informs what transmedia is, because it says, oh, every story is like contained in itself. And if you want stories that branch and interact and do whatever, then it's like a special thing. And that's not what stories do usually. There's the whole myth of the lone genius inventor in anything is not true. We are pack animals. Herd animals? You know what I mean.
Social animals, yeah.
Social animals.
That one. Thank you.
Sometimes I feel like a pack animal, so
I'm gonna withdraw the not my native language card.
that's okay.
Yeah.
I think it works.
Yeah.
Princess, I'm going to give you the last word because we're coming up on it. We're over an hour now, and I know I need to get going because Black Friday sales don't sell themselves.
I kind of like the copyright laws because as a person of color, a lot of our stories are, if it weren't for copyright, a lot of our stories would be taken and abused. So I believe that and would not be in our communities.
That's a good point.
So,
That's a good point. And
Or-
I,
and families. And also, I believe that transmedia, as it is now, is actually more beneficial to minority groups and marginalized groups than it was 10, 20 years ago. Because me, as a Black LGBTQ member, in growing up in the 90s and the 2000s, yeah, I'm that young. There was really nobody per se online when the internet and Facebook was coming up. Nobody I could talk about my interest in sci-fi and horror and fantasy. Most of them were white and older. But as the internet and transmedia became to evolve and become widespread, those will it produced avenues for people of color and other minority groups to be able to form communities and interact and intersect. That's why even though a lot of people bring back to Twitter, a lot of white people are leaving Twitter, but for minority groups, Twitter was that place where we were able to say what we feel and be active and protest. And so for us, for a lot of us, we're going to stay until the end. So it is transmedia, and copyright, I think, is much beneficial for minority and marginalized groups than it is for white people.
no, I think that's a really good point. And I think given how this conversation ended, we might need a future topic that just looks at copyright and even government regulation and how that impacts a popular culture and fandom experience. So I want to thank all of you for coming in today via Zoom. And I think it was a great conversation. I learned a lot, and I'm always happy whenever I can learn a lot. So I just want to thank you all for coming in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and hopefully a weekend as well. Bye,
Thank you
everyone.
so much for having me.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.